Okay, I'm very happy to have Peter Schiff. Peter is a former guest of my show, the Goldstein on Gelt Show, where previously he spoke about the debt of the U.S. government. It was, in fact, one of our most popular shows, so I wanted to bring Peter back. Peter talks all about issues on Wall Street. He's been on Wall Street for many years. He's a very, very well-respected commentator. And, well, Peter, today we're in the heart of the election cycle. And quite frankly, as far as I can remember, this is one of the craziest times. What sort of effect should we expect the election to have on the economy?
Well, I don't know what, if any, effects the election is going to have. Or now the question would be, what about the outcome? Will the outcome have much of an effect? And it's hard to say because Trump is a bit of a wild card. I mean, certainly reelecting Hillary Clinton is pretty much more of the same. And we're guaranteed more debt, a bigger government, and a lower standard of living. And I think we are headed for a major economic crisis on an order of magnitude greater than what we lived through during the financial crisis of 2008. I think the economy is in much worse shape than it was going into that crisis. The debt obviously is more than twice the size as it was back then. So I think the underlying structural problems in the economy, which were created by a combination of bad monetary policy and bad fiscal and regulatory policy, I think that those imbalances and problems have been exacerbated by the Fed monetary policy subsequent to the bursting of the real estate bubble, and so I think we're in some serious trouble. On the other hand, Donald Trump, I don't think that he averts the crisis. I think the crisis is coming regardless of who occupies the White House. The question would be, how do we come out of it on the other side? And there potentially a Trump presidency, depending on what he does, but we might have more hope for a lasting, legitimate recovery on the other side of this crisis.
Okay, so let's talk about this in two phases. One of them is before the election, and one of them is after the election. Talk to me a little bit about how the economy or the stock market views an upcoming election, meaning when there's uncertainty. Let's start with that, and then we'll talk about what the possibilities are afterwards.
Yeah, everybody likes to say, oh, the markets hate uncertainty. Well, I think what they like less than uncertainty is certainty when what's certain is bad. And, there's a lot of bad policy that's coming, and I think that's a certainty. And I also think that we are back in a recession. I mean, whether or not the government is going to score the recession as starting late last year or early this year, or maybe even by the middle of this year, is hard to say. But I think whatever we just experienced, if you want to call it a recovery, I really don't. But if you do call it a recovery, it's already over. And now we've begun the greater recession, and we're beginning this recession, when interest rates are practically at zero, and the Fed already has an enormous balance sheet left over from the last round of monetary stimulus that we were never able to unwind.
So let's go over some definitions. One of them is the term recession. A lot of people would say, wait, what do you mean there's a recession? Look, the stock market's been doing well. If you look since Obama got into office, we've gone up a huge amount. How could you be calling this bad times?
Well, the stock market and the economy are two very different animals, and a recession refers to economic activity or economic growth. It doesn't matter what happens to the stock market. Now, the stock market has not been going up for the past year. And in fact, if you look at the average stock's been falling for 2.5 years. In fact, I think better than 50% of all stocks on the S&P 500 are now down more than 20% from their peaks. And many, many stocks are down 40, 50% or more. So we have had stocks falling for the past couple of years. So it's a little bit deceptive if you just look at the overall market, but the overall market has not been going up. I mean, the rally stopped. I mean, it was over about a year ago that we made the high in the Dow, and we haven't made a new high since. But meanwhile, oil prices are now rising again. I mean, we're now above $48 a barrel. This is the highest prices have been all year, and they're pretty much going up almost every day. And so this is not a good sign for the consumer who was kind of relying on the cheap gasoline prices to help them deal with higher rents and higher insurance, health insurance in particular, and other costs, food costs that were going up. But now you have rising gas prices. The price of gold's been strong this year. Gold's up, 17% or so on the year. Gold stocks, pretty much doubled so far this year. So where you are seeing strength in the stock market, it's not where you'd want to see it if you believed in the economy. You don't want to see the NASDAQ down 5% year to date and gold stocks doubling, that's probably not a good sign if you want to look to the stock market. But, the stock market was very strong up through 2007, even though we were setting ourselves up for a meltdown, in 2008 and the worst recession since the Great Depression. The stock market did not do a very good job of forecasting that recession. In fact, neither did the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve did not believe a recession was coming. Even as late as mid-2008, they still had no recession in their forecast, even though the recession had started 7 months prior, and they still didn't know it was coming, even though we were in the middle of it.
Let's break this down. One of the issues you mentioned was low interest rates. The other one you touched on was the price of oil. And it seems that the way that people talk about the price of oil and the expectations they have doesn't always play out. For example, when oil prices were dropping and dropping and dropping and the market was dropping, everyone said, well, because the price of oil is dropping, so the market's dropping. On the other hand, you would have thought, like you just said a minute ago, well, if oil is low, that makes the price of gasoline low and it's easy for the economy to get going because you don't have the oil tax going on. But now the opposite, you're saying rates are going up. So which is it? Do we want a low oil price or a high oil price?
Well, we definitely want a low oil price unless you've got a lot of oil that you're looking to sell. So if you're a producer, if you are an oil company, you obviously want high oil prices. But the typical American doesn't own an oil well, but he buys gasoline on a regular basis. And so we want lower oil prices. But the whole time that the oil price was dropping and the stock market was dropping, it was just a coincidence. It wasn't that one was causing the other. It wasn't that the low oil price was what was hurting the stock market. I mean, it hurt oil stocks, that's for sure, but it didn't hurt technology stocks. I mean, you can't blame a drop in tech stocks or retailers. Some of the weakest stocks were the retailers. And those are the stocks that you would think would benefit the most from cheap gas because it relieves their customers of the expense. And now the money is freed up to buy other things. So it was hard for Wall Street, although they did it, but it didn't make any sense to blame a collapse in big retailers on cheap gasoline when they would be some of the biggest beneficiaries of cheap gasoline. So what was actually happening was that the economy was weakening and the Fed was threatening to raise interest rates. And it was the idea of a slower economy, a tighter monetary policy that was causing both the stock market and the oil market to go down together. It wasn't that one was causing the other. They were both reacting to the same thing. But now, right, the oil market is starting to rise because the markets are now starting to price away some of those rate hikes, and the dollar is now weakening. The dollar had its weakest quarter in 5 years in the first quarter. So a weak dollar and the Fed not hiking rates as much as people thought, that is causing the dollar to go down, and that is causing the gold price, or rather the oil price too, to go up. But corporate earnings are under a lot of pressure because the only reason that theoretically the Fed is not raising rates is because the economy is too weak to allow it. And part of the problem with a weak economy is weak earnings. So now you have the stock market caught between two counterbalancing forces. You have one, more cheap money or fewer rate hikes, which is supportive of the markets because of the extra liquidity. But then you have the reality that the reason the Fed is not hiking rates is because the economy is much weaker than they thought. And if the economy is weaker, so are corporate earnings.
Let's break this down even further, because now you've been talking about low rates, and you also mentioned a weak dollar. So there are certainly those people who would say that a weak dollar ultimately is very good for the United States and will help us to get out of a recession and will help the stock market because it means that people can export the goods to sell them all over the world, whereas a very strong dollar is going to prohibit that. And at the same time, with interest rates really continuing to be very low and the Fed not seeming to be interested in raising them much at all, it seems that this is going to make cheap money available, and that liquidity is certainly what seems to be able to help fuel the economy.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, it fuels inflation. It fuels malinvestments and speculation, but it actually inhibits real economic growth. Look, a weak dollar doesn't help our exports because we don't have a lot to export. I mean, what a weak dollar does is it increases the cost of our imports, and it means that we have to export more to pay for our imports. But since we can't do that, we end up with even bigger trade deficits with a weaker dollar than when we have a stronger dollar. And that's been the recent history of the United States. As the dollar goes down, our trade deficits get worse. They don't get better. Our trade deficits were the largest in history in mid-2008 when the dollar was the lowest in history. And if I'm correct and the dollar does continue to fall, it's just going to make our trade deficits bigger and bigger and bigger because we're going to have to pay more and more money for all the things that we import because we do not have the capacity to produce those things domestically because the industries no longer exist. The plant and equipment is no longer here. The skilled workers are no longer here. We're just importing. We don't have the products to export. That's one of the problems with Donald Trump's let's just build some walls and have some tariffs. That's not going to do anything to bring back our jobs because the industries that used to employ the workers are no longer here. They're no longer viable. They've been dismantled over the generations because of all the high taxes and high regulation. All this activity now takes place outside the United States, and we rely on the strong dollar to import all the things that we don't produce ourselves. And as the dollar weakens, it becomes harder and harder for Americans to live beyond their means because the secret to that is the ability to take print money and export it to buy real goods. And as the dollar goes down, that becomes more and more difficult to do.
Are people feeling the inflation that you mentioned before, or does it seem because the numbers that come out of the government don't seem to be terribly inflationary at this point?
Well, first of all, considering how weak the economy is, if you look at the weakness of economic growth, there's still positive inflation. It's a positive number. Even the government numbers, let's say the government claims inflation is somewhere between 1% and 2%. That still means that the cost of living is going up 1% to 2% a year. Most people's paychecks are going down. You've got a lot of people that used to have a full-time job, and now they only have a part-time job, or maybe they have 2 or 3 part-time jobs. But if you add them all up, they still don't earn as much as they used to when they had one good full-time job. So any increase in the cost of living under these circumstances is a problem. But I don't believe the government's numbers are accurate. I think the cost of living is rising more rapidly than the government CPIs would suggest. I mean, you can look at rents. I read recently that rents year over year are up about 8%. That is a huge jump in rent. And rent is a big cost. I mean, for most people, that's their biggest expense. I mean, maybe if taxes could be their biggest, if you add Social Security taxes, state taxes, federal taxes, but not counting taxes, that's probably number one. Now, your second biggest expense was probably healthcare or health insurance, and their costs are rising even faster than rent. So you got two big costs, healthcare and rent, really, really going up at much, much faster pace than the CPI. And of course, once you finish paying your rent, your healthcare, and your taxes, a lot of Americans don't have much money left. But, food prices are going up, utility prices are going up. I mean, I don't know where the government is getting such low CPI numbers when so much of what Americans buy is, a lot more expensive. And I know that when you poll voters, I haven't seen one of these polls too recently, but certainly over the last several years and last elections when the government was saying there was no inflation. But the polls, when you ask people about the economy, poll after poll was showing that the biggest concern that voters had was rising prices. And that doesn't seem to make sense. If there's no inflation, why would rising prices be so predominant in the concerns that typical people have? And, I think one of the reasons, too, that people like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are so popular is because the economy is much worse than the government reports. Because if things really were as good as Obama claims or as Janet Yellen claims, I don't think Bernie Sanders would be getting so many votes. And I don't think Donald Trump would have won the Republican nomination or be the presumptive nominee if the voters were more satisfied with the career politicians and the status quo. The fact that voters on both sides of the aisle are so desperate for anything different, whether it's a populist or a socialist, it's an indication that they know things are bad. Because if they were satisfied, if things were good, they wouldn't want to take a chance on screwing it up. It's only because things are so bad that they're willing to try anything.
All right, so Peter, let's swing back around because you brought this all around back to the elections. And tell me, if you get a call from either Hillary or Trump asking you to be an advisor on the economy, what would be the top thing that you would suggest that they do in their first 100 days?
Well, first of all, I'm not expecting such a call.
No, I can arrange it, so I'm well connected.
If one of them called me, I would assume that it was some kind of a joke. It was some, but I mean, I suppose that Trump is probably more likely to make such a call than Hillary. I mean, I can't imagine Hillary Clinton under any circumstances caring what I have to say, given the huge gulf between us when it comes to policy and politics.
Okay, but let's
and
assume
economics.
we're all
But
open-minded and we're having a discussion, and you have the chance to give your 2 cents for the number one step that one of these people should take as the new president in order to change America to be on the trajectory that, as you're describing, could hopefully get us out of the mess.
yeah, well, I believe that, Trump's idea of making America great again, and I would like America to be great again, but that recognizes the acknowledgement that we are no longer great, and we're not, and we haven't been great for a long time. But in order for America to be great again, we have to understand why America became so great in the first place and why America today is so different from that America. And the America that became great was the America that was created by our founding fathers and the principles that were in the Constitution. And these are principles of limited government, of individual sovereignty, of the rugged individual, of government simply there to protect private property, against people who would steal from you or attack you. So the government was really there to stop people from doing bad things, but it wasn't there to redistribute wealth or to provide safety nets or to micromanage the economy, and for politicians to decide this is what we think we should have, or this is what we should have, and we should take money from this person and give it to that person, or have all these programs. That was not the kind of country. We had a minimal government that did very, very little, and we relied on the individual. We had maximum freedom and minimal government. We had sound money. We were on a gold standard. And we thrived and we prospered. And America built a society wealthier than anything that had existed in history. We built a middle class that was really a concept that wasn't even known prior to America. I mean, there was just rich people and everybody else. And we created a society where everybody benefited from the hard work of the individual, of the entrepreneur. Everybody's pursuing their own self-interest. It was the Adam Smith invisible hand on a grand stage, and it really proved to work beautifully. And we had this really great, wealthy society, but we destroyed that. We destroyed that with government. We destroyed that by minimizing individual liberty and now maximizing government, and having all sorts of decisions made by government. We went away from honest money to centrally planned paper money. And it's a disaster what the Federal Reserve has done. And we have this enormous government in Washington that is spending a fortune and regulating, and has got its tentacles in just about everything that we do. And it's very difficult for people to succeed and prosper. It's very hard to hire people in America now. I mean, the government has made that very difficult. It's very difficult for people to succeed and start their own businesses. It's not that it's impossible. It's just that the bar to do that successfully has been lifted so high now, thanks to government. It used to be much lower, and it was much easier to succeed. So we need to start rolling back government. I mean, all these big grandiose plans about what government can do, government is a complete failure. We need to undo all the terrible things that government has done. We were in much better shape 100 years ago, before we had all these rules and regulations. So we need to try to recreate the America of the past. Right. And I'm not talking about going back to slavery, right? We don't have to go back far. But, we can go back to around 1900,
I know. Would you want to live in 1900, or would you want to live in today?
Well, I mean, obviously, look, I don't want 1900 technology. I want 1900 freedom, right? I want the liberty and the freedom that my grandparents had when they arrived in this country. But I don't want to give up the benefits of 100 years of progress that has been made despite big government. And the interesting thing is, if you ever try to think about this, imagine what 21st century America would look like, in 2016. Imagine what this country would look like had we maintained the level of government that we had in 1900 consistently throughout the last century. Imagine the progress that would have been made that wasn't made. Imagine the things that we would have today that we don't have. I remember when I was a little kid, I don't know how old you are, but you ever watch The Jetsons?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so The Jetsons was made in the 1960s, and people were just assuming that the type of progress that had been ongoing would continue into the Jetson future. And in the Jetson future, not only did Jane not have a job, right, because they couldn't even foresee women working in the 1960s. I mean, why would a married woman with children work? Because her husband had a job. But not only did Jane not work, but George barely worked. I remember George complained that the 3-day work weeks were killing him, right? It was like, because the weekend was 4 days or 2 day. Maybe it was only two. It was a 2-day work week. You work for 2 days and the weekends were 5 days because they just assumed that the progress would continue where we would continue to automate and mechanize. And so that the need to work would be smaller and smaller and smaller. And our standard of living would keep going up and there was all these gadgets. I mean, I think that I don't know that we would have flying cars and all those kind of things, but I do believe that had we stayed on our trajectory that we were on, yes, we wouldn't have married women with children working, and men wouldn't be working 2 or 3 jobs. They'd have one decent job and they'd probably work fewer hours, and people would retire a lot earlier. People would have a lot of savings. We'd have a much higher standard of living. And who knows what extra inventions we would have come up with had we had less government. Who knows what diseases we would have cured if we didn't have the FDA. If the government didn't make it so expensive to develop cures, maybe we would have cured cancer by now. Who knows? We don't know, but I think we would have a much higher standard of living. But when people say, Peter wants to go back to the 1900s. No, I want to have, I want air conditioning. I like computers and I like a cell phone. And I like indoor plumbing. And, I like these things. So I don't want to give them up. But I'd like to have my freedom, too, and then we could be a lot more prosperous.
So that is what Peter Schiff would say to Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton as president. Listen, Peter, I will be sure to send them that monologue so they have it and they can use it as they like to prepare their
one more thing, though. They
speeches.
They have to prepare the American public for some pain, right? Just like, if you're going to go up to a drug addict and say, okay, what advice are you going to give a drug addict, right? Well, it's you got to stop doing drugs. And so the advice is not to, do more drugs so you don't have to deal with the pain of withdrawal or, having to, go through a rehab. So that's what they have to prepare America for, because we're like a gigantic drug addict and we're addicted to cheap money and big government. And it's a very, very debilitating habit. And if we don't kick the habit soon, we're going to overdose on this stuff. So I'd rather do it voluntarily because we check ourselves into rehab than we get dragged in there by our foreign creditors because we have a dollar crisis, which unfortunately is where this situation is headed. So people have to level with the American public and tell them how screwed up we are and what really needs to be done. And it's not, something from government. The government cannot solve our problems. The government is our problem. What the government has to do is extricate itself from the economy, remove itself. We need to massively dismantle much of government. And that means a lot of people who are getting checks from government are going to have to be told, you're not getting that check. And, when Donald Trump says something like, I'm not going to touch Social Security, we need to touch Social Security because we can't afford to keep taxing young people to give money to older people, especially when the older people are wealthier than the younger people who are being taxed. And the young people who are being taxed can't afford to pay these taxes. They can barely get out of their parents' basements, let alone handle their student loan debt. They can't pay Social Security taxes so their grandparents can play golf. So we're going to have to level the American public, let them know how broke we are, and that people have to rely on themselves. They can't rely on the government. They can't rely on some type of program. And the solution is not a program. It's getting rid of the programs and letting the people find their own solutions. Unfortunately, the problems that were made by government.
All right, so we will have to look for that, and we will have to spread the word to the people who are living in their parents' basement and the drug addicts. Peter, tell us, how can those folks listening to us today learn more about your ideas and follow you?
Well, I'm all over the internet. I do my own podcast, the Peter Schiff Show at schiffradio.com. It's also on, iTunes or all these different places that the podcasts are. So make sure and listen to that, either Schiff Radio or go to my YouTube channel, The Schiff Report. We post them up there. I also do video blogs on my YouTube channel. I've got a number of books out there that you could read, the most recent one being The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, How to Save Yourself and Your Country. And in fact, when Donald Trump talks about restructuring the debt or defaulting on the debt, even though he wants to backtrack, that is exactly part of my prescription in my book, that we are bankrupt and we have to admit it. And rather than taking on new debt, we need to restructure the debt that we already have that is unpayable. And so that is part of it. But if people want to do something proactively to protect their wealth, because there is a real crisis coming that is going to bankrupt, I think, the vast majority of Americans. I think the dollar is going to crash because we're not going to do the right things. And people are going to watch their retirement dreams vanish as their portfolios collapse and as the cost of living skyrockets beyond their ability to be able to afford it. So to try to do something in advance to both protect yourself from this and actually profit from these events, you should contact one of my brokers or go to my firm. It's Euro Pacific Capital, Europac.com, EUROPAC.com is my website. And you can go on there and you can contact us and talk to one of my brokers. And also, if you don't own any gold or silver, I have a company, Schiff Gold, my last name, SCHIFFgold.com. I sell gold and silver, and I've got about the cheapest prices online. So before you buy from everybody else, you should give Schiff Gold a call and make sure you're not overpaying.
Okay, we will put links to all of that at the show notes of today's show. Peter Schiff, thanks so much for your time.
Hey, my pleasure.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.